1933, the White Star Line was on the verge of collapse. Multiple changes in ownership, political missteps, and questionable business decisions left the company ill-equipped to face the challenges of the Great Depression. As passenger numbers evaporated, the once mighty company was in crisis. J. Bruce Ismay, the former chairman and managing director, the man who in 1907 dreamed up the Titanic and her sisters, stepped out of his 20-year retirement to help save the company his father spent his life building. He devised a plan that would capitalize on the company's strengths and adapt them to the economic conditions of the 1930s. The White Star Line wasn't unique. Their greatest rival, the Cunard Line, was mired in their own financial difficulties at the time. Construction on their new superliner, labeled Hull number 534, was halted as the company desperately searched for funding. Ismay's plan to save the White Star Line might have worked, but the shipping tycoon's reputation never recovered from the Titanic disaster, and by the time he stepped in, the company was well past the point of no return. His plan was shelved, and the White Star Line was officially folded into the Cunard Line on May 10, 1934. J. Bruce Ismay died 3 years later, on October 17, 1937. Today, the White Star Line is synonymous with disaster. Everyone knows the Titanic, but the average person probably couldn't name another White Star Liner, so it's easy to assume that the company's downfall was a direct result of the sinking of the Titanic. Why would anyone step on board a White Star Liner after April 1912? But the reality of the company's downfall was much more complicated. Passengers continued to sail on White Star Liners long after Titanic, and while the tragedy was a major setback, the company remained profitable for years, and might have survived well into the 1960s and beyond if circumstances had been slightly different. In 1845, the White Star Line began operation in Liverpool, focusing on trade with Australia. This iteration of the company saw some initial success, but by the mid-1860s, a series of bad investments left the company with a debt of £527,000, a staggering amount roughly equivalent to £47,600,000 today. This forced the company into bankruptcy. The White Star Line was all but dead, but then, on January 18, 1868, Thomas Ismay stepped in and purchased the rights to the White Star name. Despite the financial woes, the company was a known entity at this point with a decent reputation. Ismay wished to capitalize on this brand equity and use it to begin operating a large steamship line on the North Atlantic. Over the next 4 decades, under Ismay's leadership, the White Star Line would grow into one of the largest and most respected passenger shipping lines in the world. Thomas Ismay's oldest son, Joseph Bruce Ismay, was born on December 12, 1862. When he was just 11, his beloved older sister Mary contracted scarlet fever and died. This loss had a profound impact, and Bruce grew up to be a shy and highly sensitive man. This was a quality that his father found difficult, but Bruce remained very devoted to his parents and spent his life trying to live up to his father's strict and lofty expectations. On September 13, 1880, when he was 18 years old, Bruce began his apprenticeship with the White Star Line. His father was adamant that his son not receive any special treatment, and throughout his 3 years as an apprentice, his father would publicly admonish the new office boy if he did anything an ordinary employee wouldn't do. Bruce Ismay was 6'4", strikingly tall, especially for back then. He was slim, athletic, and always immaculately dressed. While he was always a bit standoffish, people tended to like him quite a bit once they got to know him. Those who knew him well considered him a kind, trustworthy, and generous man of good character. After his training, Ismay became New York's White Star agent. He developed a vibrant social life in New York and made many lifelong friends. Eventually, he crossed paths with William Randolph Hearst, who had recently inherited his father's San Francisco newspaper. Eager to expand his business, he invited Ismay to join him, but Ismay found Hearst's sensationalized style of journalism distasteful, and he turned down the offer. Hearst took Ismay's rejection extremely personally. This conflict with the powerful newspaper tycoon and his overall discomfort with the press and public speaking would come back to haunt Ismay. He continued to work his way up through the White Star Line, and on November 23, 1899, when Thomas Ismay died, he took over the company. While his father was thoughtful and deliberative, Bruce was decisive and opinionated. He proved adept at the role, and the White Star Line entered its golden age at the turn of the century. This period saw the launch of several major liners that would generate massive profits, many of them the largest in the world at the time of their launch. This success caught the attention of the American banking mogul J.P. Morgan, who you may know from that ATM down the street that smells like urine. In an effort to monopolize the transatlantic shipping industry, Morgan created what became known as the International Mercantile Marine Company, or IMM for short, and began buying up as many shipping lines as possible. To cement the trust power, Morgan set his sights on the White Star Line. Ismay was reluctant to agree to the acquisition. He knew his father would vehemently oppose such an arrangement, but Morgan offered the White Star Line shareholders a price equal to 10 times the company's earnings in 1900, a very profitable year. The offer was too lucrative to refuse. In April 1902, the White Star Line was sold, and in 1904, Bruce Ismay reluctantly agreed to become the president of the IMM. He would also continue in his role as president of the White Star Line. Not long after the deal, his mother Margaret Ismay would write in her diary, December 1st, Monday, Messrs. Morgan have paid all the shareholders of the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company for their shares. This ends the White Star Line, in which so much interest, thought, and care was bestowed, and which was my dearest one's life's work. The International Mercantile Marine was never the global juggernaut that Morgan had hoped for. Aggressive buying and ship orders for less successful subsidiaries left the trust critically over-leveraged. The White Star Line, however, proved to be the crown jewel, as the years leading up to 1912 saw continued financial success for the company, bolstered by a huge influx in European immigration to the United States. The Olympic class was the culmination of this success. Financed through private loans granted on the success of the Big Four, the company's previous generation of superliners, the Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, were to be the largest and most luxurious liners in the world. After her maiden voyage in June 1911, the Olympic proved to be an immediate success. It seemed that the White Star Line would soon cement its dominance over the transatlantic shipping trade. But we all know what happened next. On April 14, 1912, the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg on her maiden voyage and sank in 2 hours and 40 minutes. This was obviously a devastating event for the White Star Line. The Commodore of the company, Captain Edward Smith, and the line's chief builder, Thomas Andrews, were both lost in the sinking. As I'm sure you're well aware, Bruce Ismay was also on board. His actions on the night of the sinking are a source of great debate and controversy. This is when his falling out with William Randolph Hearst and his poor relationship with the press came back to haunt him. Hearst's newspaper empire immediately made Ismay a central villain of the tragedy. He was painted as a callous, greedy, and cowardly man who encouraged the company to cut corners during building, urged the ship to travel at an unsafe speed, and stole a seat in a lifeboat that could have gone to a woman or child. And this is how Ismay has been depicted in nearly all Titanic media since, including James Cameron's 1996 film. But little of this was based in reality. Despite numerous theories and investigations, there's little evidence to suggest that the Titanic was built to a lower standard than any other ship at the time. In fact, she was equipped with more safety features than most of her contemporaries. As for the number of lifeboats on board, her original designer, Alexander Carlisle, testified at the British Inquiry into the Sinking that while he originally intended that the ship carry more lifeboats, this was merely a suggestion during the design process that never actually made it to Ismay. So Ismay never even had the opportunity to reject this idea. The claim that Ismay pressured the Titanic to sail at an unsafe speed is almost entirely based on the testimony of one first-class passenger who claimed to overhear a conversation in which Ismay urged Smith to arrive in New York ahead of schedule to beat the crossing time of the Olympic. In several depictions, this was changed to Ismay urging Smith to try for a speed record, which obviously would not have happened because the Titanic, even if pushed to her maximum possible speed, would never have been capable of competing for the speed record held by the Mauretania at the time. Ismay would have been well aware of this. It's well documented that on the night of the sinking, Ismay was probably the first passenger to be told that the ship would sink. He quickly understood the gravity of the situation and spent most of the sinking urging people into the lifeboats. Many were hesitant at first to leave the ship, and Ismay's almost frantic urging likely saved many lives. There's no evidence to suggest that Ismay used his influence or took any extraordinary action to secure his seat in a lifeboat. All accounts suggest that he just happened to be in the right place at the right time. The deck around Collapsible C, one of the last boats to leave the ship, was completely clear, and just before it was lowered, Ismay and another first-class passenger, William Carter, stepped into the half-empty boat. It seems that Ismay's greatest sin was simply surviving, even if he did nothing to cause the tragedy, and only happened to be saved by a simple twist of fate. Some believe that out of honor, Ismay should have refused the open seat, even if that seat remained empty. I suppose I can't argue with that, but I would suggest considering what you would do in that situation. Ismay apparently almost immediately regretted his decision and spent the rest of his life blaming himself for the tragedy. While he was officially cleared of any wrongdoing, he resigned from the IMM and the White Star Line the following year. One of his last efforts with the company was ensuring that all IMM ships be equipped with enough lifeboats for everyone on board. He devoted much of his efforts over the following years to ensuring that relatives of the victims of the disaster received compensation and led a somewhat solitary life aside from the company of his family, who he remained close with for his entire life. Despite the setback, the White Star Line rebounded somewhat quickly. The Olympic was withdrawn from service on October 9, 1912, to undergo a significant refit to address the design flaws that doomed the Titanic. She re-entered service in March 1913 and was heavily advertised as the new Olympic. Much to the White Star Line's relief, passengers quickly re-embraced the beloved liner. The third Olympic-class ship, to be named Britannic, underwent significant design changes to further improve safety. But just as the company seemed on the road to recovery, the First World War brought major new challenges to the White Star Line. On June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, the presumptive heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated. This set off a chain of events that ignited the First World War. On August 4, 1914, Great Britain officially declared war on the German Empire after Germany refused to remove troops from neutral Belgium. The White Star Line was consumed by the conflict. All 35 vessels in their fleet at the time were in some way requisitioned to serve the British war effort. Some of their ships were initially converted to auxiliary cruisers, while other liners, like the Olympic, were converted into troop carriers. The Britannic was still under construction when hostilities began, but she too was requisitioned and completed by the Admiralty, who converted her into a hospital ship. On November 21, 1916, she struck a mine near the island of Kea in the Aegean Sea and sank. She was the largest ship sunk in World War I and remains the largest passenger shipwreck on the sea floor. The White Star Line lost a total of 10 ships in the conflict, including the Oceanic, Arabic, Cymric, Laurentic, Afric, and the Delphic. Their fleet carried nearly 550,000 soldiers and 4 million tons of supplies over the course of the war, with the Olympic alone transporting over 200,000 troops. Having lost nearly one-third of their fleet and 2 of their 3 largest liners, the White Star Line's position was greatly weakened going into 1919. To compensate for their losses, the company was given 3 German liners handed over to the British as war reparations: the SS Berlin, which was renamed the Arabic, the SS Columbus, which was renamed Homeric, and the largest passenger ship in the world at the time, the unfinished SS Bismarck, which would be renamed the Majestic. Despite a brief boom in transatlantic migration following the war, the United States Immigration Act of 1924 severely crippled the migrant passenger trade, which was the backbone of the passenger shipping business. But the White Star Line was able to quickly pivot and converted the third-class accommodations on many of their liners to a new tourist class, which catered to the burgeoning European tourism industry that began to flourish in the 1920s. The company also began to offer cruises toward the end of the decade. With the Olympic, Majestic, and Homeric making up their premier New York service, the White Star Line again flourished, but internal issues with the IMM that boiled just beneath the surface left the company far more vulnerable than their success would suggest. The International Mercantile Marine was racked with issues long before it acquired the White Star Line. Despite several appeals, the company was never able to secure subsidies from the United States government, and the endeavor was buried in crippling levels of debt almost from day one. J.P. Morgan died on March 31, 1913, less than a year after the Titanic disaster. While the very concept of the IMM was heavily criticized in the wake of the tragedy, it did not bring about the end of the company. Debt continued to mount, and in 1915, the conglomeration was placed in receivership. But the war paused efforts to alleviate the situation. It would need to dump its British holdings if it was ever to become solvent. In 1919, Lord Peary, the chairman of Harland and Wolff, and Owen Phillips, who would later gain the title Lord Kilsant in 1923, offered £27 million for the British flag tonnage in the IMM fleet. But at the last minute, the deal was vetoed by President Woodrow Wilson. Not long after, the White Star Line entered an agreement with the British Board of Trade that stated that they would not be considered a foreign-controlled company, despite the American ownership. This meant that their fleet had to remain British-flagged, and it granted the Board of Trade the power to approve or reject board members. This put the IMM in an awkward position as its troubles continued to grow. Lord Kilsant was at best a terrible businessman and at worst a criminal. In 1902, with financial help from his brother John Phillips, Kilsant acquired shares of the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company and became chairman and managing director later that year. Over the next several years, he would acquire a controlling interest in more than 20 companies, including the Union Castle Line and the Pacific Navigation Steamship Company. After the death of Lord Peary in 1924, Lord Kilsant became the head of Harland and Wolff. Despite the rejection of his initial bid in 1919, he never lost interest in eventually owning the White Star Line. While the company's transatlantic routes thrived throughout the 1920s, the Australian routes were falling behind, creating issues for the company. By 1925, the IMM was once again looking for a buyer. After a deal with another buyer fell through, Lord Kilsant stepped back in and purchased shares of the White Star Line in November of 1926 for £7,907,661. The deal made Lord Kilsant's shipping empire the largest in the world, with a fleet of well over 2 million tons. But Kilsant's empire was a financial and operational mess, and this deal, unfortunately, hopelessly entangled the White Star Line in the quagmire. Numerous questionable acquisitions and building deals were struck during this period, many of which plunged forward without solid financial backing. On June 18, 1928, it was announced that the White Star Line would build its largest liner to date, the Third Oceanic, a 1,000-foot vessel powered by a new diesel-electric propulsion system. Construction began at Harland and Wolff, but work was paused in 1929 to study the proposed propulsion system. It would never resume. By this point, Lord Kilsant was funneling revenue from the profitable White Star Line to fund his many debts. His many questionable business practices came to a head in 1931, when Lord Kilsant was arrested in what became known as the Royal Mail case. He was eventually found guilty of falsifying records in an attempt to make the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company look profitable and attractive to potential investors. He was sentenced to 12 months in prison, and his holdings, including the White Star Line, were liquidated. This all occurred as the Great Depression devastated the transatlantic passenger shipping business. For the first time in its history, the White Star Line ended 1930 with a loss. It entered the new decade at the mercy of its creditors and the British government. Despite the financial turmoil, the White Star Line managed to produce two wildly successful liners during this period. In 1929, the MV Britannic sailed her maiden voyage. The modest and economical but stylish liner would prove a massive hit with the traveling public, as would her sister, the MV Georgic, which entered service in 1932. It was around this time that J. Bruce Ismay stepped out of his nearly 20-year retirement and put forth a plan to save the business he and his father spent most of their lives building. His plan would make a firm offer to the trustees to purchase the company's assets and form a new White Star Line that would build additional liners modeled after the success of the Britannic and the Georgic. But this plan never came to fruition. Since it was never implemented, it's impossible to say whether it would have been successful. But the idea demonstrates that even in his later years, Ismay had a keen understanding of the passenger shipping industry. More than anything, it shows what could have been had the company been under competent leadership during these critical years. As the mess created by Lord Kilsint was unraveled, the White Star Line was unable to repay debts he incurred with the Australian government. The company was forced to sell all ships dedicated to the Australian route, significantly reducing the tonnage of their fleet. Several other older liners were also sold in an attempt to repay debts incurred by Kilsint. In 1930, Sir Percy Bates became chairman of the Cunard Line, which was also hit hard by the Great Depression. Bates was an effective and visionary leader who leveraged the Cunard Line's long relationship with the British Admiralty and his ties to the royal family to garner favor before they were forced to request government funds to resuscitate the company and resume building what would become the RMS Queen Mary. With the two premier British passenger lines on the verge of collapse, it was clear that the government would have to step in. Neville Chamberlain, the Chancellor of the United Kingdom's Treasury at the time, proposed a deal that would offer a financial lifeline on the condition that the two companies merge. On December 30th, 1933, the directors of both companies agreed. The details of the merger were laid out in the North Atlantic Shipping Bill of 1934. The government would lend the new company £9,500,000, enough to maintain operations, complete the Queen Mary, and fund what would become the Queen Elizabeth. The deal allocated ownership based on the tonnage each line brought to the merger. Cunard would hold 62%, while White Star Line would hold 38%. On May 10, 1934, Cunard White Star Limited was officially created. While the newly merged company retained the White Star name until 1949, and the White Star house flag was flown on various occasions for decades after, this was effectively the end of the 85-year-old White Star Line. Had the merger occurred only a few years earlier, White Star easily could have come out on top. But shrewd political maneuvering by Sir Percy Bates capitalized on the leadership vacuum that plagued the White Star Line in its final years. J. Bruce Ismay suffered a massive stroke and died 3 days later, on October 17, 1937, at the age of 74. In the end, the White Star Line didn't fail because it lost the Titanic. It failed because it lost Bruce Ismay, or at least the decisive leadership he brought to the company. We'll never know what might have happened if the Titanic never sank, and what the rest of Ismay's career would have looked like, or how long he would have helmed the company his father built. The White Star Line's downfall is frustrating because most of its problems came from troubled ownership and poor financial decisions, first from the IMM and then Lord Kilsint. Despite all of this, the company continued to build and operate innovative and popular ships, even in its final years. Had leadership remained with someone like Thomas Ismay or his son Bruce, would the White Star Line exist today? It's fun to imagine cruising the Caribbean on a gleaming White Star Line cruise ship, but we'll never know, because in the end, like the Titanic, everything came together to do the White Star Line. Just before 11:40 on the night of April 14, 1912, 4th Officer Joseph Groves Boxall had just finished making a cup of tea in the officers' quarters when he heard 3 bells ring out from the Titanic's crow's nest. As he hurried back to the bridge, he heard First Officer William Murdoch order hard to starboard, and the jingle of the engine order telegraphs. Before he could even reach the bridge, Officer Boxall felt a shudder run through the ship. He stepped onto the bridge to find Murdoch turning the lever to close the ship's watertight doors and sounding the alarm down below. While the extent of the Titanic's damage was unclear, the severity of the moment was palpable. Within moments, Captain Edward J. Smith was on the bridge. He ordered Boxall to head to the ship's forecastle and inspect the damage. Boxall hurried down an emergency stairway to the well deck and descended to the lower passenger decks. He made it as low as F deck, and to his great relief, he found no signs of flooding or significant damage. Eager to deliver the good news, he raced back to the bridge. As he crossed the well deck, he noticed a small amount of ice scrapings covering the deck. He reported his positive findings, but Captain Smith was unconvinced, and asked him to find the ship's carpenter and have him sound the ship. Boxall soon learned that the ship's mailroom was flooding. His hope was dashed. At around midnight, he was ordered to wake the off-duty officers. 3rd Officer Pittman and 2nd Officer Lightoller were already awake and realized the gravity of the situation when Boxall told them that the mailroom was flooding. 5th Officer Lowe was in a deep sleep. Boxall woke him, but he almost immediately fell back asleep. By the time Boxall carried out the order, the lifeboats were already being prepared. He began helping the seamen unlace the canvas coverings on some of the forward boats when he got word that the lights of another ship were spotted somewhere off the Titanic's bow. Once again, eager to report the good news, Boxall raced to the bridge to look for himself. On his way, he ran into Captain Smith. He told him about the lights and asked if they should try sending a signal. Smith told him that a distress signal had already been sent and asked him to recalculate their position to make sure that their wireless calls were accurate. The mystery ship would have to wait. Reading the gravity of Captain Smith's replies, Boxall asked, "Is it really serious?" Without skipping a beat, Captain Smith replied, "Mr. Andrews tells me he gives her from an hour to an hour and a half." Stunned, Boxall raced to the navigation room to recalculate their position. Any shred of hope he had left was gone. The Titanic would sink, and from that moment on, every action he took was life or death. When he finished calculating their position, he passed it on to the wireless operators and then returned to the bridge to look for the ship that he heard about earlier. He quickly spotted a light on the horizon off the Titanic's port bow. Boxall identified that the vessel was a 2-masted steamship. He immediately went to the ship's Morse lamp, which was capable of projecting signals for miles, and began trying to establish contact. Captain Smith spotted the lights too, and told Boxall to tell them to come at once. But the mystery ship didn't respond. Boxall decided to try something more dramatic. He took one of the distress rockets stored in the bridge and fired it from the starboard bridge wing. The rocket shot between 600 and 800 feet in the air and exploded in a magnificent shower of light and sparks. White stars slowly descended back down to sea. The rocket captured the attention of everyone on the Titanic's boat deck, igniting a new sense of urgency as passengers realized that the situation might be more serious than they initially thought. Boxall was soon joined by Quartermasters Rowe and Bright, and the three began sending up rockets at intervals of around 5 minutes. Maritime regulations were vague at the time, simply stating that rockets were to be sent up at short intervals to signal distress. It was a constant battle to keep people clear from the rocket detonators. At times, it appeared that the mystery ship might be sending a signal. Boxall and Rowe continued trying to make contact with the Morse lamp, but they could never make out any clear message from the ship on the horizon. By around 1:45, the men continued using rockets in the lamp, growing more desperate by the minute as the deck around them gradually descended into chaos. Nearby, Captain Smith was overseeing the loading of lifeboat number 2. He turned to the bridge and saw Boxall standing nearby, and he ordered him to take command of the lifeboat. A few minutes later, Chief Officer Wild ordered Quartermaster Rowe to take command of Collapsible C. The last rocket was fired at around 1:50, and with that, efforts to make contact with the mystery ship were abandoned as the Titanic began her final plunge. By the early evening of Sunday, April 14, 1912, the crew of the Leyland Line's cargo liner SS Californian began encountering icebergs. The modest combination passenger cargo liner was sailing from London to Boston. She came in at a little over 6,000 tons and was operated by a crew of 55. While she could accommodate around 47 passengers, on this particular voyage she only carried cargo. At 6:30 p.m., the ship's 20-year-old wireless operator, Cyril Firmstone Evans, sent a message to another Leyland liner, the Antillean, warning that they had spotted 3 icebergs 3 miles to their south. Harold Bride, one of the Titanic's 2 wireless operators, also heard this message and reported it to the bridge. The Californian continued cautiously. Her captain, Stanley Lord, noted that visibility that night was especially challenging. Stars were repeatedly mistaken for signals, and with the sea so calm, it was difficult to make out where the sky ended and the water began. At around 10:20, the ship encountered a large ice field, and Captain Lord ordered the ship to stop for the night. They would wait until the morning light to maneuver around the ice. As he left the bridge to inform the ship's chief engineer, Captain Lord thought he saw the lights of a ship just on the horizon off their starboard side. But he wasn't sure if this was just an especially bright star. He told his chief engineer that they would be stopping for the night out of safety, but that the engineers should remain ready just in case. While the men spoke, Captain Lord glanced out the cabin window, and he noticed the lights of the large steamer heading toward them. The captain then went to the wireless cabin and spoke with Evans. He asked if there were any ships nearby. Evans told him that the only ship close to them was the Titanic. Captain Lord asked Evans to send a warning, letting the Titanic and other ships know about the ice field. Evans sent the message, "Say, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice." Cyril Evans went to the Marconi School with Titanic's junior wireless operator Harold Bride, and he was also acquainted with senior operator Jack Phillips. All 3 were employees of Marconi's wireless telegraph company. It was common for wireless operators to use informal language and shorthand when messaging one another. OM, for instance, short for old man, was frequently used to greet each other. Evans was also reaching the end of his workday, which started at 7 a.m. He was the Californian's only wireless operator. He did not start his message with MSG, which stood for Master Servicegram, the code for messages meant to be passed along to the bridge. The atmosphere in Titanic's wireless room at the time was completely different. On a larger ship, wireless messages were primarily a novelty for paying passengers. Communication between ships was a secondary function. The day before, the ship's wireless equipment failed. Jack Phillips spent hours working to fix the machine despite guidelines that suggested that he should wait until the ship docks for a technician to fix the set. If he had waited, the story of the Titanic would have been very different. When the machine was finally fixed, Phillips faced a massive backlog of messages that had to be sent to Cape Race. These were private messages purchased by first-class passengers. The signal from Cape Race was quiet and sometimes hard to hear. Phillips was exhausted. Suddenly, Cyril Evans' message blasted over his earphones. The proximity of the 2 ships made Evans' message extremely loud, easily drowning out or jamming the messages from Cape Race. Tired and frustrated, Phillips sent the following message to Evans. "Keep out, shut up, I'm working Cape Race." Much has been made about the apparent tone of this message. Some have even claimed that it prompted Evans to go to bed for the night, but this isn't true. Evans was already past the end of his shift, and he was wrapping up for the night regardless of what the Titanic said to him. He listened to messages until around 11:25, and at 11:35 on Sunday, April 14, 1912, Cyril Evans went to bed. In his testimony at both the American and British inquiries into the sinking, Evans did not express any anger or annoyance at the message he received from Phillips. At the American inquiry, Senator Bourne asked Evans if he thought the message was strange or if it was a customary message to send when someone breaks in to prevent jamming. Evans replied, if he was working, he had a lot of messages to get off. Cyril Evans understood the workload Phillips faced, and while the message sounds rude out of context, it was not strange or jarring for Evans, and it doesn't seem to have had any impact on his decision to go to sleep that night. Phillips never passed the warning onto the bridge, but ice warnings from the Californian and other ships had been delivered to the ship's officers earlier in the day. When Cyril Evans went to sleep, the ship that was by far the closest to the Titanic could not hear her cries for help. On the Californian's bridge, 3rd Officer Charles Groves spotted the lights of another liner at around 11:10 p.m., 10 to 12 miles off their starboard beam. It was clear to Grove that it was a large liner. At 11:30, he informed Captain Lord, who was napping in the chart room after 17 hours on duty. Captain Lord asked Groves to try and contact the liner using the ship's Morse lamp. Despite trying several times, no one on the Californian could make out any reply from the passenger liner. Then at around 11:40, the liner came to a stop and seemed to turn out some of her deck lights. The Californian's officers assumed that she simply stopped for the ice field. At midnight, 2nd Officer Herbert Stone assumed command. He also saw the liner's lights and guessed that it was only around 5 miles away. An apprentice officer, James Gibson, was also on the bridge that night, and he operated the ship's Morse lamp. Then Stone saw the ship fire a white rocket. A few minutes later, he saw another one. By 12:55, he counted at least 5. But he later insisted that he never thought the rockets were a distress signal. He informed Captain Lord about what he saw, but the captain simply told him to keep trying the Morse lamp and wake him if anything changed. He did not order his officer to wake the ship's wireless operator to try and contact the mystery liner. The sight made the men on the bridge uneasy. Stone said to Gibson, "A ship is not going to fire rockets at sea for nothing." And he also commented that she looks very queer out of the water. Her lights look queer. She looks rather to have a big side out of the water. Gibson would later testify that Stone went as far as saying everything was not all right with her, and even remarked that it looked like a case of some kind of distress. But Stone was adamant after the fact that at the time he did not think the ship was in distress, and he did not interpret the rockets as a call for help until after he learned that the Titanic sank. Instead, he thought they might be some kind of company signal. At 2 a.m., the ship's lights began to fade away, and they soon disappeared. Stone assumed that she sailed away. At 3:40, they saw more rockets to the south, likely fired by the Carpathia, as she was then speeding to the scene, sending up rockets to try and signal the Titanic. They didn't know at that point that she was gone. At 4:16, Officer Stone sighted the Carpathia. By 4:30, Captain Lord was awake and he took command. He began preparing the ship to maneuver through the ice field. He finally sent Chief Officer Stewart to wake Cyril Evans to see if he could find out what happened with the mystery liner. Evans almost immediately learned from the Frankfurt that the Titanic had sunk. The Californian was soon underway and sailed west for a time, before finally returning to the area to aid in rescue efforts. She rendezvoused with the Carpathia at around 8:30, after the Carpathia had already finished picking up the Titanic survivors. The Californian remained in the area to search for survivors while Carpathia raced back to New York. All the Californian found was wreckage, abandoned lifeboats, and bodies. Soon, they resumed their course to Boston. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxall was placed in command of Titanic's emergency lifeboat number 2. Through the night, he periodically lit flares, hoping to signal a rescue ship. Finally, just after 4 a.m., the Carpathia appeared on the horizon, and Boxall lit a flare to flag down their rescuers. Once aboard, he was brought to the Carpathia's bridge. Shaking and on the verge of tears, he told Captain Arthur Rostron that the Titanic was gone. Boxall was one of many called to testify at the United States Senate inquiries into the sinking. He was the first to tell of the mystery ship that sat only a few miles away while the Titanic sank. It was immediately suspected that the mystery ship was the Californian. Captain Lord and the ship's officers were called to testify. They recounted what happened, at times somewhat defensively, and claimed that the Californian was approximately 19 miles from the scene of the disaster. Lord was adamant that while he and his crew thought what they witnessed was strange, they never once thought that they were looking at a ship in distress. There's a chance that this could have been self-preservation. At the time, according to the Merchant Shipping Act of 1906, it was a misdemeanor to fail to respond to a distress call. Both the American and British inquiries concluded that the Californian had to have been closer to the Titanic than her officers claimed, and the British inquiry went so far as to say that the Californian could have saved many, if not all, of the lives that were lost that night. But both inquiries stopped short of issuing any charges. Still, Captain Lord's reputation never recovered. He was fired by the Leyland Line in August 1912. While he found work with a less prestigious company, he was seen as a pariah for the rest of his life. Ever since the presence of a mystery ship was first mentioned, speculation and theories have run wild over the identity of the ship, Captain Lord's actions, and the exact location of both the Titanic and the Californian that night. Some have even speculated that there was another ship present and the Californian was actually not visible from the deck of the Titanic. But this theory seems highly unlikely since the timeline of what was seen on both ships align almost perfectly. Whether or not the Californian could have made it to the Titanic in time to rescue her survivors is also a subject of intense debate. The only certainty in the Californian affair is that Captain Lord should have woken Cyril Evans to use the wireless to investigate what was happening. Evans would have realized the situation the moment he began listening to his wireless set. But any blame on Evans is truly unfair. You can't blame someone for going to sleep at the end of a long workday. Almost immediately after the disaster, the United States passed the Radio Act of 1912, which required a 24-hour radio watch on all ships. Numerous other regulations followed, including standardized distress signals to eliminate any potential doubt. Captain Stanley Lord was widely vilified, and while his actions that night are questionable, he was not responsible for the loss of the Titanic. As the authors of On a Sea of Glass so eloquently state, there are no villains in the Titanic story. So often, we want our stories to be black and white, with good guys and bad guys, heroes and villains. If we can find the evil, we can stamp it out. We can protect ourselves. But the Titanic tragedy, like so many other disasters, resulted in a long series of mistakes and misjudgments. What if the lookout sighted the iceberg a minute earlier? What if Captain Smith ordered her speed reduced? What if she carried 20 more lifeboats? Chance and circumstance don't care about our attempts to clarify the chaos of the world. Things just happen. We can prepare and plan and hope, but there will always be something we don't expect. Rather than focus on trying to find a villain, I prefer to look for the heroes. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxall and the rest of Titanic's crew responded to the unfolding disaster professionally and effectively. Their efforts saved hundreds of lives. Joseph Boxall spent the next 30 years of his life at sea before he retired in 1940. He was always reluctant to talk about the Titanic disaster, but he worked as a technical advisor on the filming of A Night to Remember in 1957. He passed away on April 25, 1967, at the age of 83. His ashes were scattered at the last position he calculated, the night Titanic sank. Late one night on an eastbound crossing early in the Olympics' career, her senior wireless operator, Ernie Moore, was listening to the dull ship-to-shore chatter from the wireless station at Cape Race. Nearing the end of his shift, he turned his Marconi set over to the commercial wavelength to listen in on ship-to-ship messages. At around 12:45 a.m., he picked up a muffled message from MGY, the call sign for the Olympics' new sister ship, the RMS Titanic. But atmospheric interference made it difficult to pick up the signal. Moore was confused and cut into the chatter of numerous other ships to ask if the Titanic needed help. Then he waited. The chatter of other ships in the area increased. Something big was happening. Finally, 10 minutes later, he received a brief but chilling reply from the Titanic. She was sinking fast and needed immediate assistance. Moore acted quickly. He ran to the bridge, and just 10 minutes after the Olympic received the message, Captain Herbert J. Haddock ordered full steam in the direction of the stricken liner nearly 500 nautical miles away. But hours later, when she was just 100 nautical miles away from the scene, with the Titanic signal now long silent, a message was received from Captain Arthur Rothschild of the RMS Carpathia. The Titanic was gone. There was nothing the Olympic could do to save her sister. The RMS Olympic and her two sisters were the culmination of a long cycle of one-upsmanship between the White Star Line, the Cunard Line, and their German competitors. The White Star Line was at its peak in the early years of the 20th century with the Big Four, launched between 1901 and 1906. At the time, they were the largest and most luxurious passenger ships afloat, and they would all go on to enjoy long and profitable careers. But before they could even launch the last of the Big Four, the Adriatic, the Cunard Line launched a liner that would revolutionize the Atlantic passenger trade on June 7, 1906. The Lusitania was only around 7,000 tons larger than the Adriatic, but her 24-knot service speed made her and her sister, the Mauretania, significantly faster than any of the competition. For decades, the White Star Line had elected not to pursue speed records. Competing for the blue ribbon was costly, and winners would usually only hold the title for a year or two before being outdone by some new rival. Instead, the line focused on size and luxury. But with the introduction of the Lusitania, the White Star Line was losing on both fronts. Something had to be done. Lord Peary, the controlling chairman of Harland and Wolff, initiated extensive and costly modernizations and expansions to the shipyard between 1906 and 1908. 3 shipways were converted into 2 significantly larger ones in preparation for the inevitable response to Cunard. Finally, in the summer of 1907, J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, had dinner at Lord Peary's home in London. Over the course of the evening, Ismay and Peary discussed plans for what they called the Big Ship, and after dinner they drew up rough plans for 3 sisters that would set the standard for safety, luxury, and economic operations. These plans were announced one day before the Lusitania arrived in New York on her maiden voyage. Bruce Ismay would take an active role in the designs for the new liners, which would evolve rapidly from a 3-funnel to a 4-funnel design. Initial concepts were presented to the White Star Line on July 29, 1908. They called for accommodations for 3,104 passengers and included a first-class lounge, smoking room, and dining saloon, all topped by magnificent glass domes, but somewhat conventional stairwells. While numerous changes would be made to these concepts, the overall design would largely remain the same. And on July 31st, the White Star Line signed a letter of agreement for construction to proceed. Despite ownership by J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Company, the trust actually did not finance the new liners. Instead, the White Star Line took out a series of commercial loans to finance the Olympic trio. This differed from Cunard, which relied on low-interest government loans to finance several of its ships. During this period, the White Star Line was enjoying unprecedented levels of success, with a net profit of £6,175,852 from the preceding 10 years, nearly double the profit of Cunard. In 1907 saw a further 50% increase in profits. The White Star Line was riding a high, and Bruce Ismay and Lord Peary were eager to build a liner that reflected and maintained the company's dominance. On December 16, 1908, the keel was laid down for Harland & Wolff's 400th commission, labeled Yard Number 400 TSS Olympic. 3 months later, in the next slipway, the keel was laid down for Yard Number 401 TSS Titanic. The two sisters would be built nearly in tandem. Between 3,000 and 4,000 workers assisted in the construction of the Olympic. The details of her design were overseen by Alexander Carlisle until his retirement on June 30, 1910. When Thomas Andrews assumed his duties. Technical details of the design were overseen by Andrews' deputy, Edward Wilding. The question of her machinery would not be answered until several months into her construction. Quadruple expansion reciprocating engines proved very successful on previous White Star liners, including the Oceanic and the Big Four, but the Lusitania's turbines were also considered a great success. But while turbines were the latest innovation, efficiency and passenger comfort were the #1 priority, and Lusitania's turbines were causing vibration issues and her speed came at a cost in fuel consumption. With that in mind, it was decided that the Olympic would split the difference with 2 triple expansion reciprocating engines that would drive her 2 outer propellers and a low-pressure turbine engine powered by the steam exhaust that would drive a center propeller. But before committing to this configuration, a test was conducted with 2 mid-size liners being constructed to service the Canadian routes, the Laurentic and the Megantic. The Megantic was given the conventional reciprocating engines, while Laurentic was outfitted with the new combination system. Laurentic's performance proved superior to her sister, and the combination system was confirmed for Olympic on April 20, 1909, just 5 days after the Laurentic had been delivered. Siemens Martin steel was used for the Olympic's shell plating and upper works. It was considered battleship quality steel and proved successful on previous liners that were decades into their career by that point. Her hull was divided into 16 compartments with watertight doors that could be closed manually or from a control panel located on the bridge. She was equipped with 14 regular lifeboats, 2 emergency cutters, and 4 collapsible boats, more than the regulations required at the time. Titanic would receive the same arrangement, up from the original plans that called for just 14 boats and 2 cutters. As you probably already know, this configuration was not enough to hold every passenger on board. But at the time, lifeboats were intended primarily to ferry passengers from one ship to another. It was thought that in an emergency, the wireless Marconi equipment could be used to call other ships on the busy North Atlantic shipping lanes, and help would arrive before the ship could go under. This, wasn't a good idea. The Olympic was launched on October 20th, 1910. Her hull was painted a brilliant white to make her stand out in press photos. The event was attended by thousands and presided over by Lord Peary, and she was christened by nobody because the White Star Line didn't christen their ships. Gasp. A rocket was fired at 11 a.m. and the Olympic was released down the slipway to wild cheers, whistles, and applause at the awe-inspiring sight of the largest moving object ever created, sliding smoothly into the water. The Olympic was outfitted over the next few months. Her first-class public rooms and promenades occupied an incredible 90,000 square feet, with the majority of these spaces situated on A deck, starting with her reading and writing room, just past her grand staircase. The room was decorated with bright white walls and large bay windows that filled the space with light. Plush furnishings and thick velvety carpeting softened the room. While beautiful, the space, which was intended for women to retire to, proved unpopular, and was cut down to add additional first-class staterooms in subsequent refits. Passengers greatly preferred to spend their time in the next room, the Grand First Class Lounge. The 59 by 63 foot space was decorated in the Louis XV style, with rich, finely carved wood paneling, plush furnishings and carpeting, all topped with a large crystal chandelier. The warm and inviting room was flanked by a marble fireplace and a large bookcase, and featured several cozy alcoves and large windows that filled the space with light. Just past her aft grand staircase came the 61 by 65 foot first-class smoking room, paneled in fine mahogany. The room was decorated with intricate stained glass panels, lit from behind that depicted mythological scenes. A Norman Wilkinson painting, The Approach to the New World, hung over a large marble, coal-burning fireplace. The space, which was reserved for men, was allotted at the time as one of the most palatial rooms afloat. The aftmost first-class space on A deck was the light and airy Veranda Cafe and Palm Court. The garden-themed rooms mirrored each other and were decorated with mirrored walls, wicker furnishings, and ornate trellises with climbing plants. Light refreshments were served throughout the day, and the two rooms were a popular spot for after-dinner coffee. Her lounge and other public spaces were bookended by her forward and aft grand staircases, undoubtedly the most recognizable and impressive spaces on the ship. Significantly grander than the bland concept presented in her original D plans from 1908, her forward grand staircase reached from F deck to her boat deck. It featured walls that were paneled in rich carved oak and a curved staircase with balustrades supported by iron scrollwork with bronze accents, all culminating in a sweeping iron and glass dome that flooded the space with natural light. The uppermost landing featured a clock with two female figures symbolizing honor and glory crowning time. The space also featured 3 lifts that spanned from E to A decks. The aft grand staircase mirrored the grander forward staircase, though slightly smaller and ending on A deck. It offered a sense of symmetry and reflected the ship's balanced design. Her forward grand staircase led to a sweeping 5,000 square foot D-deck reception room, decorated with Jacobean white paneling, light wicker furnishings, bronze ceiling lights, and intricate leaded Luxfer glass windows that were lit from behind at night, giving the space a warm and inviting glow. The room gave passengers a space to gather and socialize on their way to dinner in the accompanying 10,000 square foot dining room. Being 114 feet long and spanning the full width of the ship, the first-class dining saloon was the largest room afloat at the time. This room continued the Jacobean style of her reception room and featured finely carved oak furnishings. The Olympic also featured an a la carte restaurant on B deck, decorated in a plush Louis XVI style, with French walnut paneling and delicate light fawn brown colors. The space represented a growing trend on larger liners, offering an alternative to the main dining room for an additional fee. The exclusivity of such a space proved popular and generated extra profits. The ship also boasted a lavish Turkish bath, modeled after a popular feature on the Adriatic, that further set the Olympic apart from the Lusitania and the Mauretania, which lacked such facilities. The space was incredibly ornate and offered a variety of treatments that seem a little scary by today's standards. She also boasted a saltwater pool and a well-equipped gymnasium. Her first-class staterooms offered unprecedented space and luxury. These were decorated in numerous styles ranging from Empire, Adams, Georgian, Louis XVI, Regency, Modern Dutch, and Old Dutch. While a bit less glamorous, her second-class spaces were comfortable and luxurious, often finer than the first-class spaces found on rival vessels. And though largely utilitarian, she offered clean and comfortable third-class accommodations that were some of the best available at the time, often lending standards better than most third-class passengers were accustomed to on land. The Olympic cost somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million pounds to build, and measured 882 feet long with a beam of 92 feet, and came in at 45,324 gross registered tons. She could accommodate 2,435 passengers and a crew of 950, and her combination system of propulsion achieved an impressive service speed of 21 knots. Though she didn't match Lusitania's speed, she bested her Cunard rivals in nearly every other category. She was by far the largest passenger liner ever put to sea, and she immediately set a new bar for what passengers could expect while crossing the Atlantic. The RMS Olympic sailed her maiden voyage on June 14, 1911, captained by Edward Smith, the Commodore of the White Star Line. Thomas Andrews, Bruce Ismay, and the Harland and Wolff Guarantee Group were on board to iron out any issues with the new ship. The Titanic was launched only a few days before, on May 31st. The voyage proved successful, earning the Olympic worldwide acclaim. Her first 8 crossings would go on to demonstrate her popularity with passengers and the potential for profit she would enjoy for most of her career. But then, on September 20th, 1911, the Olympic collided with the British cruiser HMS Hawke on the Solent. Her size and turning radius took the crew of the Hawke by surprise, and her powerful propeller sucked the small warship's bow into her side. The collision flooded 2 watertight compartments, but no one was injured. Despite the damage, the Olympic was able to return to Southampton on her own power. In order to get the Olympic back into service as quickly as possible, the propeller shaft intended for the Titanic was used to replace the one damaged in the collision, delaying Titanic's completion. The repairs took just 6 weeks to complete, and the Olympic was able to return to service by November of that year. On March 30th, 1912, Captain Smith left the Olympic to take command of her sister. He was replaced by Captain Herbert James Haddock. Over the course of his career, he captained several White Star liners, including the Titanic, for a brief period of time before she was delivered to Southampton for her maiden voyage and turned over to Captain Smith. On April 13, 1912, the Olympic left New York for a routine eastbound crossing. The next 48 hours would forever change her career. After receiving Titanic's distress signals at around 12:45 a.m., the Olympic raced at full speed to the scene of the unfolding tragedy 500 nautical miles away. Though Captain Haddock responded quickly to the situation, lighting all possible boilers to maximize her speed, there was still considerable confusion about what was actually going on. After Titanic told Olympic to ready her boats and asked her position, Olympic responded by asking if the Titanic was speeding south to meet them. The urgency of the situation became clear when Titanic responded by saying that they were putting passengers off in small boats. Soon the Titanic's distinctive signal went silent, but the Olympic would continue trying to contact her sister throughout the night. By mid-morning, passengers slowly began piecing together fragments of what happened. All concerts were canceled in a sign of respect, and soon passengers began raising money for the survivors, collecting nearly $7,000. Almost 14 hours after receiving Titanic's distress calls and 100 nautical miles from the scene of the disaster, the Olympic received a message from Captain Arthur Rostron of the RMS Carpathia. All survivors had been taken aboard. There was nothing more the Olympic could do to help. When Olympic offered to take some survivors, Rostron declined, fearing that the sight of Titanic's identical sister would only further traumatize her survivors. Instead, Olympic resumed her course and helped relay the list of survivors to New York. She finally arrived in Southampton at 2 a.m. on April 21st. Captain Haddock was reportedly exhausted by the experience. But in the coming days and months, the trauma felt by the rest of Olympic's crew would soon turn into outrage. Immediately after the disaster, the inadequate number of lifeboats on both the Titanic and the Olympic came under intense scrutiny, and the White Star Line promised to equip their ships with enough lifeboats for everyone on board. In the scramble to quickly make good on this promise, 24 collapsible boats from troop ships were installed on the Olympic's boat deck at the end of April 1912. At first this seemed adequate, but as she was set to sail to New York, 284 of her firemen went on strike. They felt that the second-hand collapsibles were unsafe and demanded wooden lifeboats be installed instead. These firemen were well aware that nearly all the men that held their job on the Titanic died in the disaster, and they wanted assurances that there would be space for all of them in seaworthy lifeboats if a similar disaster occurred on the Olympic. The company brought in 100 non-union crew members to replace the striking crew, but obviously this didn't solve the situation, and the sailing was finally canceled. 54 of the striking crew members were arrested for mutiny, and on May 4, 1912, they were found guilty, but they were discharged without fines or jail time and allowed to return to work on May 15th because of the circumstances of the situation. Finally, on October 9, 1912, the Olympic was withdrawn from service to undergo a significant refit to further improve the ship's safety and ensure public trust in the liner. Changes were extensive. Her lifeboat capacity was increased from 20 to 68, and extra davits were installed along the full length of her boat deck to accommodate them. A double hull was constructed in her boiler and engine rooms, and 5 watertight compartments were extended up from the original height on E or D deck to the full height of her hull on B deck. This would prevent water from spilling from one compartment to the next, and would effectively prevent the Olympic from sinking if she were to experience a similar disaster as the Titanic. Improvements were also made to her pumps, making her more capable of dealing with a breach. The White Star Line also seized the opportunity to make improvements to her passenger spaces, largely on B deck, including adding extra cabins, more private bathrooms, and a new Café Parisien like the one on Titanic. She re-entered service in March 1913 and was briefly again the largest ship in the world until the Imperator entered service in June of that same year. She was marketed as the new Olympic, with her new safety features heavily advertised. She was once again embraced by the traveling public and enjoyed a few more months of peace before World War I would bring a new challenge to her career. The Olympic initially remained in commercial service, with her hull painted gray and her windows blacked out. She helped rescue survivors from the battleship HMS Audacious during her last commercial voyage in October. Then, in May of 1915, she was requisitioned by the Admiralty to serve as a troop ship. Her unfinished sister, the Britannic, was also requisitioned for use as a hospital ship. The Olympic was armed with 12-pounders and 4.7-inch guns and converted to carry up to 6,000 troops per voyage. On November 21, 1916, HMHS Britannic struck a mine and sank in the Aegean Sea, leaving the Olympic the sole survivor of the trio. During her war service, HMT Olympic was commanded by Bertram Fox Hayes, a longtime veteran of the White Star Line. The Olympic would prove more than just a valuable troop ship. On May 12, 1918, while sailing for France in the English Channel, a surface U-boat was spotted. The Olympic opened fire on U-103 as they attempted to crash dive, and acting fast, Captain Hayes turned his giant ship to ram the enemy sub, hitting just aft of her conning tower. The Olympic's port propeller sliced through the pressurized hull, crippling the U-boat and forcing her crew to abandon her. They were picked up later by the USS Davis. The Olympic continued on to Southampton, having only suffered 2 dented hull plates and a twisted prow, but no breach. Captain Hayes was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, and a plaque was placed in the Olympic's lounge commemorating the event. Over the course of the war, in addition to sinking a damn U-boat, the Olympic carried around 201,000 troops and traveled 184,000 miles, and Captain Hayes was knighted for his exemplary service. Having overperformed in nearly every way, the Olympic was finally ready to return to passenger service and live out the dream she was designed for. In a refit after the war, the Olympic was converted from coal burning to oil, significantly boosting her efficiency and reducing her turnover time, which used to take days. This also reduced her required engine room crew from 350 to just 60. She returned to passenger service on June 25, 1920, and proved more popular with passengers than ever. This was her heyday. She carried a number of celebrities and was considered one of the most fashionable ways to cross the Atlantic. She was refitted a number of times over the 1920s to remain competitive in the ever-changing market. In response to new immigration laws in the United States, her third class was converted to tourist class in 1927 to attract tourists looking for comfortable and affordable travel options. And in a haunting coincidence, on November 18, 1929, the Olympic began to violently vibrate near the site of the Titanic disaster for around 2 minutes. The strange occurrence was later found to have been caused by the 1929 Grand Banks earthquake. The 1930s proved challenging for older liners, and the Olympic was no exception. The Great Depression greatly reduced travel, and the market was saturated with a generation of new liners with modern features that made the Olympic and her contemporaries feel increasingly outdated. Her passenger numbers took a major hit, and on many voyages she sailed less than half full. The White Star Line attempted to keep her up to date, carrying out a major refit in 1932, but despite these efforts, she continued operating at a loss. In 1933, she carried just 9,000 passengers. Then, in 1934, the Olympic played a part in one last tragedy. On May 15th, in heavy fog, as the Olympic headed to New York, she passed too close to the Nantucket lightship. Failing to turn in time, the giant liner sliced through the tiny vessel, killing 4 of the lightship's crew members instantly. 3 more died from their injuries later on, leaving just 4 survivors. That same year, the White Star Line merged with Cunard to form the Cunard White Star Line. With the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth slated to soon enter service, older liners like the Olympic, Majestic, and Mauritania were all retired. The Olympic left New York for the last time on April 5, 1935, and after a brief layup in Southampton, she was transported to Yarrow for scrapping. It was reported that her engines and hull were as sound as ever as they were torn apart. Over the course of her career, she completed 257 round trips across the Atlantic and traveled over 1.8 million miles. She carried over 430,000 commercial passengers and was widely regarded as one of the most successful and beloved liners to sail the Atlantic. During the war, the Olympic earned the nickname Old Reliable, which is somewhat ironic given that her nearly identical sister is now synonymous with disaster. I know this might be a slightly controversial opinion, but to me, the Olympic proves that most of the misconceptions about Titanic's design and safety are exaggerated or flatly untrue. The Olympic trio were marvels of design and engineering. They were deeply pragmatic ships that made passenger comfort and safety a top priority. The Olympic made ships built only a few years before look ancient. Her long career and loyal passenger base only demonstrate her achievement. The Titanic was unlucky, and she suffered a situation that would have taken down most any of her contemporaries in many ships today. Sometimes, when you're sure that you've thought of everything, something unexpected throws everything into chaos. Sometimes, what you think is the best just isn't good enough. But we keep trying, we learn from our mistakes, and we keep sailing on. The Olympic had a long and reliable career. She exemplified the best of ocean travel. And overshadowed by tragedy, she carried on, and she triumphed.
I don't think the Board of Trade Regulations visualized this situation.
RMS Titanic was equipped with 16 wooden lifeboats and 4 collapsible boats. While this provided seats for only around half the people on board, it was actually more lifeboats than the regulations mandated at the time. She featured modern Welland davits that could easily double or even triple her lifeboat capacity. But this didn't seem necessary. The conventional wisdom was that lifeboats were mostly intended to ferry passengers from one ship to another. They were not meant to carry every person on board for a long period of time after a sinking. But what prompted this thinking? The designers and builders of the Titanic were well aware that their ship could sink. But they were confident in their design. She was equipped with watertight compartments that could contain or at least slow the flooding in an emergency. She was designed to operate in the North Atlantic, on the busiest shipping route in the world. It was thought that if something terrible should happen, another ship would almost certainly be nearby to mount a rescue. Their confidence wasn't just built on years of innovation and design. It was bolstered by another White Star liner that sank just as plans for the Titanic and Olympic were coming together. A disaster in which the heroic actions of a wireless operator saved nearly everyone on board and created a false sense of confidence in the safety of shipping at the time. The sinking of the RMS Republic taught shipbuilders all the wrong lessons and helped seal the fate of Titanic's passengers. In the late 1890s, a young Italian inventor, Guglielmo Marconi, was determined to demonstrate the capabilities of his new wireless messaging system. Marconi was far from the first person to discover that signals could be transmitted wirelessly using electromagnetic waves, but he was one of the first to develop a practical system to harness these waves to send wireless messages using Morse code. More an entrepreneur than an inventor, Marconi was eager to promote and commercialize his invention. At just 25 years old, he was invited to demonstrate his work in the United States for the first time at the America's Cup International Yacht Races off Sandy Hook in the autumn of 1899. The Americans were deeply impressed that the results of the races could be transmitted wirelessly to Manhattan in just seconds. The transatlantic shipping companies were eager to install Marconi's devices. The ability to offer wealthy passengers the opportunity to send messages to their friends or family at home from the middle of the North Atlantic, for a modest fee, was a no-brainer. While a Marconi wireless set would offer novelty and convenience for passengers, The equipment played little role in the operation and navigation of the ships they were installed on. Operators weren't considered a part of the ship's crew. They were employees of the Marconi Wireless Company, working on board through contract. In the early days of wireless, a new crop of young enthusiasts quickly formed radio clubs throughout the world as the technology gained a following in popular culture. Typically teenage boys, these were truly the tech nerds of their day. Soon, hundreds of young men were signing up to learn Morse code and become wireless operators. They quickly developed a language all their own. The letters OM, short for old man, was a common term of camaraderie. Another code, CQD, was thought up as a distress signal. While wireless sets were installed on ships for commercial purposes, many of these young radio operators recognized the potential aid wireless communication could provide in an emergency. CQD was short for Seeking You Danger, but by 1909, this distress signal was never actually used. One of these young enthusiasts was Jack Benz. He was born in Brigg, Lincolnshire on September 16, 1884, to an average working-class family. At just age 12, Jack landed his first job as a messenger for the Great Eastern Railway in Peterborough. In 1898, he was struck by a railway car, severely injuring his legs. Ordinarily, his legs would have been amputated, but the doctor decided against the procedure because he was sure that Jack would die. But Jack recovered and eventually returned to work with the aid of crutches and began working as a junior operator. In just 2 years, he fully recovered from his injuries. After a series of jobs where he studied every aspect of wireless radio, Jack enrolled in the Marconi Training School at Seaforth and he was certified in just 3 months. His first assignment was on the German liner Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse in 1905, but 3 years later, the German government banned foreign wireless operators from their ships. So Jack was reassigned to the White Star Line. His first assignment was the liner RMS Republic. Constructed at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland, the RMS Republic started her career as the SS Columbus. She was built for another international mercantile marine subsidiary, the Dominion Line, a sister company to the White Star Line. Launched on February 26, 1903, she sailed her maiden voyage in October of 1903. But after only 2 voyages, the Columbus was sold to the White Star Line and renamed the RMS Republic to hold the name following the sale of the original Republic in 1889. Designated to sail between Liverpool and Boston, the Republic was well appointed for a ship serving this secondary route. She was on the larger side for the time, coming in at 15,400 tons, with a length of 570 feet or 173.7 meters, and a beam of 67.8 feet or 20.7 meters. Her twin propellers achieved a service speed of 16 knots, and she could accommodate up to 2,830 passengers with a crew of 300. While she's since gained a reputation as the millionaire's ship, the luxury of her interior spaces is a little over-exaggerated these days. She certainly boasted spacious and comfortable accommodations that were class-leading for the routes she serviced, but she was only on par, if not slightly below, what was offered on larger liners designed for the premier New York routes operated by White Star, Cunard, and other European lines. Part of what gained the Republic this reputation came when she was assigned a new Mediterranean to New York service in November of 1904. At around this time, there was a growing surge of immigration from Italy to the United States, and also a burgeoning European tourism industry. This meant that the Republic could take wealthy Americans to the Mediterranean on eastbound crossings, a role her fine accommodations were well suited for, and return filled with immigrants on westbound voyages, a role her expansive third class was also well suited for. The Republic might have also carried a considerable shipment of gold coins when she sank, which was actually unrelated to her wealthy passengers. But this potential gold cargo has greatly added to the millionaire ship story over the years, but we'll get to the gold later. The surge of immigration from Italy to the United States was also creating a boom for Italian shipping companies. To accommodate this increased demand, the Lloyd Italiano line commissioned a new 5,000-ton vessel, launched on June 22, 1905. The SS Florida was a modest ship designed to carry just 25 first-class passengers and 1,600 third-class passengers. She could achieve a modest 14-knot service speed and was overall fairly unremarkable. On December 28, 1908, Messina was rocked by a 7.1 magnitude earthquake that killed between 75,000 and 82,000 people. The disaster displaced thousands and prompted a new surge in immigration as refugees fled the devastation. On January 10, 1909, the SS Florida left Naples for New York loaded with 850 refugees on a government-funded relocation voyage. Most of these passengers had little choice but to immigrate to the United States. A little over a week later, at 5 p.m. on the evening of Friday, January 22, 1909, the RMS Republic left New York Harbor with 742 passengers and crew, bound for the Mediterranean. Many of these passengers were wealthy Americans beginning their vacations. She was under the command of Captain Inman Silby. In the first hours of the voyage, the Republic's lone wireless operator Jack Benz spent the evening sending commercial messages and a few location reports. As they neared Sandy Hook, the liner sailed into a dense fog bank. At midnight, Jack finally allowed himself to get some rest, and he turned in for the night as the ship's automatic foghorn rang out into the darkness. The Florida was on the last day of her voyage to New York when she was overtaken by a dense fog bank. Without any visual references, the liner was essentially sailing blind in the early morning hours of January 23, 1909. The 200 miles between Sandy Hook and the Nantucket Lightship was known at the time as the Times Square of the Seas. More than 24 vessels passed through the area every night. To organize the congestion, east and westbound lanes were established with 30 miles of separation between them. Commanded by 28-year-old Captain Angelo Respini, the Florida was sailing well outside the proper channel as they searched for the Nantucket Lightship. On the Republic, with no other tools available, Captain Silby left his wheelhouse and stood on his bridge wing listening in the darkness. He soon heard the faint sounds of another ship. Realizing that the sound was fast approaching, he took decisive action and ordered the ship hard a port. He sounded his whistle to signal for the oncoming ship to do the same. But the Florida instead turned in the opposite direction, putting the Republic directly in her path. Why the Florida made this maneuver is unknown, but it's suspected that the quartermaster who was at the wheel at the time might have panicked and mixed up the order, turning the ship in the wrong direction. As the lights of the Republic materialized in the fog, Captain Respini realized that there was nothing they could do. At 5:47 a.m., the Florida's bow smashed into the Republic amidship on her port side, slicing from deep within her engine rooms up through her upper passenger cabins. 2 first-class cabins bore the brunt of the collision. One occupied by a wealthy liquor wholesale manager Eugene Lynch and his wife Mary, and the other occupied by banker William James Mooney and his wife Okella. Mary Lynch and William Mooney were critically wounded and died not long after the collision. Eugene Lynch was also severely wounded. 3 crewmen housed in the Florida's bow were also killed in the collision, including 14-year-old Salvatore D'Amico. Salvatore lost his entire family in the Messina earthquake. With few other options, he begged Captain Respini to join the Florida's crew, and was led on just before the ship departed Naples. While the collision on the Republic was violent, the aftermath was remarkably calm. The damage was surveyed, and it was found that the ship was sinking at about 1 foot per hour. The ship's watertight compartments were holding, and her pumps were nearly able to keep pace with the flooding. But it was clear to Captain Silby that his ship would eventually sink, and he began organizing an evacuation. Only moments before the collision, Jack Benz woke after hearing a change in the fog whistles. Wireless operators usually had excellent hearing, and Benz had trained himself to pick up on even the faintest changes in sound. Suddenly, there was a tremendous crash that threw him out of bed. His quarters and the Marconi equipment inside were hit in the collision, damaging the cabin and exposing everything to the elements. Benz was uninjured, and he found that while the wireless equipment was damaged, it was possible to make repairs. But the collision cut the ship's power almost immediately. Benz acted fast. He carefully navigated the damaged ship, going deep into the dark and flooding engine rooms where he retrieved a set of auxiliary batteries. Within about an hour, he was able to get the wireless set working. The lives of everyone on board the two ships depended on the new equipment. But without ship's power, the range was limited to only about 60 miles. Benz prayed that someone would be close enough to hear their distress call. The Florida was a small and heavily loaded steerage ship. While it seemed she would survive the damage of the collision, she was only barely able to take on the Republic's passengers. The Florida's passengers were given no information about the accident. Tired and fearing that the ship was about to sink, a panic soon broke out. The ship's officers were forced to use arms to maintain control. The situation on the Republic couldn't be more different. The collision woke most of the passengers, and they quickly navigated the darkened ship and assembled on deck. The ship's crew worked hard to keep everyone calm. Coffee and sandwiches were served, as well as whiskey and other drinks. 40 minutes after the collision, Captain Sealby announced that the ship had been injured in a collision. He said that while they were in no immediate danger, it was prudent that they began evacuating to the ship that struck them, and so they began transferring passengers to the Florida. The slow and orderly evacuation started with women and children, followed by first-class passengers and then the lower classes. This was one of the few rescues with an explicit class distinction. As preparations for the evacuation began, Jack Benz reported to the captain that the wireless was working and ready to send messages. He was so cold from wading through the flooded engine room and working in the damaged wireless cabin that his teeth were chattering. The captain told him that he didn't need to be afraid, but Benz reassured him that he wasn't afraid, he was just really cold. Sealby gave him the message, and Benz raced back to the wireless set and began sending. CQD, CQD, here is MKC. MKC shipwrecked. Republic rammed by unknown steamship. 26 miles southwest of Nantucket Lightship. Badly in need of immediate assistance. This was the first time wireless was used to transmit a distress signal at sea. 47 miles away, Jack Irwin, the operator at the wireless station at Sconset on Nantucket, was just barely in range when he heard the call at 6:40 a.m. Irwin took down the message and began broadcasting it with the station's wider range. Soon, another White Star liner, the 24,000-ton RMS Baltic, answered the call. Not only was she the closest at just 90 miles away, she was also one of the largest ships in the world at the time, with plenty of space to rescue everyone on board both ships. She raced to the scene of the accident. After 2 hours of waiting, Benz was growing more concerned. He sent a message to Irwin saying that the ship was sinking faster. To his great relief, Henry Tattersall, the operator on the Baltic, was now in range and answered his message himself. "Don't worry, old man, we're bursting our boilers to get to you." The evacuation proceeded slowly. Badly injured, Eugene Lynch was lowered in a stretcher into a boat and taken aboard the Florida. When the passengers were off the Republic, the crew followed, leaving only Captain Sealby and a few officers. Jack Benz was meant to leave the ship with the rest of the crew, but he remained at his post. By 11 a.m., the Republic was listing badly. He sent an updated position to Tattersall, but in the dense fog, locating the stricken liner was like finding a needle in a haystack. By 4 p.m., the Baltic's messages were stronger than ever, indicating to Benz that they had to be very close. The two ships began firing rockets, hoping to use the sound of the blasts to locate each other. When the Baltic heard a rocket, they would sail in that direction, but with the Republic drifting in the current, it would be gone by the time they reached any one position. Benz and Tattersall messaged back and forth, relaying new positions and telling each other when a rocket was fired and if they were able to hear it. By the early evening, as darkness fell, the Republic had run through all of their rockets, and the Baltic had just one remaining. Hope was fading. Tattersall, recognizing that Benz was exhausted and growing more anxious, sent reassuring messages, encouraging his fellow operator that they would soon find them. He told Benz that the Baltic was about to fire their last rocket. The men left on board listened for the blast. The Baltic fired the rocket. On the Republic, only Benz, his hearing trained by years of listening for faint radio signals, could hear the distant echo of the blast and identify the direction it came from. He raced back to the wireless cabin and relayed the message to Tattersall. Just moments later, the the bright lights of the Baltic emerged from the fog. All through the night and the next morning, all 1,500 passengers and crew from both the Republic and the Florida were transferred in 83 boatloads to the Baltic. It was the largest transfer of passengers to ever occur at sea without any loss of life. With every passenger and most of the crew now safe on the Baltic, attention turned to trying to save the Republic. 2 more ships arrived on the scene to help, and there was even an attempt to establish a tow line, but this quickly failed, and it was clear that the ship would soon go under. Captain Sealby ordered Benz and the remaining officers to abandon the ship. The captain remained on his bridge as the Republic submerged stern first and disappeared into the Atlantic. Only moments after she foundered, Captain Sealby bobbed to the surface, and he was soon picked up from the water. The Florida was able to limp back to New York with a skeleton crew and Eugene Lynch, who was too injured to be transferred to the Baltic. He was near death as he was transported off the ship. In his final moments, he asked for a brandy and that a medal be presented to the ship's wireless operator. He died soon after. The Florida's bow was repaired, and she was soon returned to service. Jack Benz was celebrated as a hero, as news of the rescue made headlines all over the world. New York held a ticker-tape parade to celebrate the young hero, who found himself overwhelmed by all the attention. He was invited to testify before the United States Congress on behalf of a bill that would mandate 24-hour wireless coverage on all ships. He was celebrated, but Congress ignored his warnings. The Republic disaster and subsequent rescue pushed confidence in maritime safety to an all-time high. The collision was severe, and it struck the ship's engine rooms, a particularly vulnerable spot. But her watertight compartments and pumps worked exactly as they were designed to, keeping the ship afloat for hours, giving plenty of time to evacuate everyone. It was now commonly believed that major disasters on the North Atlantic were a thing of the past for modern passenger liners. Jack Benz returned to England and soon returned to work on other ships. In 1912, he received a new assignment, the brand new RMS Titanic. But he was to be married, and he wanted a job that wouldn't take him away from his new wife. So he resigned from the Marconi Company shortly before the Titanic sailed her maiden voyage. The story of the Republic is mostly forgotten today, but her fate is inextricably linked to the fate of the Titanic. Her rescue proved a concept that fueled the mounting hubris at the time, a blissful confidence in modern technology that the Titanic disaster would shatter in an instant. On March 30th, 1893, a bottle washed ashore in Ocean View, Virginia. It held a scrap of paper with a hastily written message. To who picks this up, report when you find this to our agents if not heard of before, that our ship is sinking fast beneath the waves. It's such a storm that we can never live in the small boats. One boat has already gone with her human cargo below. God let all of us live through this. We were struck by an iceberg in a blinding snowstorm and floated 2 hours. Now it is 3:20 a.m. by my watch, and the great ship is dead level with the sea. Goodbye all. At the end of March 1893, the British steamer SS Coventry arrived in Bremerhaven with troubling news. Captain Wilson reported that at 2 a.m. on March 4th, his ship was sailing on the North Atlantic approximately 500 miles east of Halifax, Nova Scotia, when they encountered an overturned lifeboat. But they couldn't find any name to indicate what ship the boat belonged to. Later that day, at 2 p.m., they found another derelict boat, this time floating upright, almost completely swamped, but in good condition. Its masts and oars were tied together and drifting on the side of the boat as a sea anchor. The small boat was labeled SS Neuronic. The two abandoned boats were found only a few miles from where the Titanic would sink less than 20 years later. They were the only verified trace of the SS Neuronic that would ever be found. The incident was a confounding mystery that sparked a small media sensation at the time. Now the lost ship is an all but forgotten historical footnote. What happened to the brand new steamship and the 74 souls on board remains one of the greatest mysteries of the White Star Line. By the early 1890s, the White Star Line, still under the supervision of Thomas Ismay, had well established itself as an innovative Atlantic shipping line. Their latest passenger liners, the Titanic and the Majestic, both launched in 1889, took turns capturing the Blue Ribbon for the fastest Atlantic crossing in 1891. They were the first White Star liners to be constructed without square rig sails and garnered international acclaim, particularly impressing Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. His country would soon begin construction on the Kaiser class of 4-funnel liners that would spark a period of fierce competition for Atlantic dominance between the European powers. The White Star Line's interests extended well beyond their premier passenger liners and included a fleet of lesser-known cargo vessels. By the 1880s, the North Atlantic cattle trade had grown considerably, with 450,000 animals making the crossing in 1889 alone. White Star Line began carrying livestock in 1888, and the industry quickly proved profitable. The company soon commissioned a series of ships that could carry livestock, cargo, and passengers. Captains were instructed to make these voyages as comfortable as possible for the animals on board. Especially in the early days, it was not uncommon for ships to arrive in port with a troubling number of dead animals. This obviously cut into profits, and White Star Line sought to avoid these losses with modern new purpose-built livestock carriers. In 1892, the company debuted its two largest cargo ships yet, the Neuronic and the Bovic. Labeled Yard Number 251, the Neuronic was launched on May 26, 1892. Costing 121,685 pounds to build, she was a relatively expensive cargo ship for the time. But a better ship meant more live animals. She was completed on July 11th and came in at 470 feet or 143.3 meters in length with a beam of 53 feet or 16.2 meters. She measured 6,594 gross register tons. She featured 3 decks and could accommodate up to 15 passengers, though she was registered to carry only 12. Mostly people sent to accompany and care for the livestock. While accommodations couldn't compare to the premier White Star liners of the time, the Neuronic promised a comfortable crossing for humans and animals alike. The vessel was powered by 4 boilers that fed twin reciprocating engines driving twin propellers to achieve a speed of around 13 knots. She was operated by a crew of 60. Her cargo spaces could hold up to 150 head of cattle, as well as several thousand tons of various other goods. To keep the animals alive, her livestock spaces were equipped with stalls, fresh water, and a ventilation system. Commanded by Captain Thompson, the Neuronic sailed her maiden voyage from Liverpool to New York on July 15, 1892. Captain Thompson would serve as her master for just a few months. He left the ship in November of that same year. She completed several successful voyages, only losing a handful of cattle on one unfortunate voyage in November. By February 1893, there was no reason to doubt that the new livestock carrier would enjoy a long and prosperous career. The SS Neuronic departed Liverpool for her final voyage on February 11, 1893. Since the Naronic was used to transport American cattle to Europe, her return voyages typically didn't carry any cattle. Instead, she carried 3,572 tons of general cargo, 2 horses, and several live pigeons and chickens, as well as 1,017 tons of Welsh coal, enough to make it to the United States and back. She was commanded by Captain William Roberts, a veteran of the White Star Line with over 20 years of experience with the company. Roberts was the Naronic's second captain, having assumed command the previous November. She had a total of 74 people on board, made up of 60 crewmen and 14 passengers. The passengers were returning home after accompanying a load of cattle on the previous eastbound voyage. The Naronic was a popular ship amongst White Star crew. Her first and second mate, 4 out of her 5 engineering officers, and all of her greasers had been with her since her maiden voyage. The rest of her crew had been with her for at least 5 voyages. Captain Roberts was the newest on the ship, having only completed 3 voyages. The ship was known to run well, even in rough seas, and offered an appealing work environment. In short, she was known to be a happy ship. This would be her 13th voyage, and there was no reason to believe it would be anything but routine. But after she dropped off her harbor pilot at Port Linus, Wales, the SS Naronic was never seen again. In those days, it was normal for cargo ships to arrive behind schedule, but soon, worry began to grow. The story first broke in the New York Times on March 2nd, 19 days after the ship left Liverpool. Her longest trip at this point had been just 11 days, and her sister ship, the slightly slower SS Bovik, had arrived in New York that day after leaving Liverpool 6 days after the Naronic. The alarm wasn't raised until she was a full week overdue. Ships that had just traveled the same route reported heavy seas, gale force winds, and heavy snow. When the SS Coventry arrived in port later that month with the news of the abandoned lifeboats, it was clear that the ship had probably been lost. But aside from the 2 derelict boats, nothing was ever found. With the frigid temperatures, there's no way anyone would have survived in the water for more than a few hours. This was, after all, the same area where the Titanic would meet her fate almost 20 years later. There was intense media speculation at the time over the fate of the missing freighter, with stories of potential boiler explosions, getting carried off course, and even ridiculous articles about wives driven mad by grief. But with so little evidence, there was no satisfying way to explain the ship's disappearance. But then, the bottles began to appear. On March 3rd in Bay Ridge, New York, the day after the news of the missing ship was first printed in the New York Times, a bottle was found containing the following message. February 19th, 1893. Naronic sinking. All hands praying. God have mercy on us. It was signed L. Winsell. On May 30th, in Ocean View, Virginia, another message washed ashore in a champagne bottle. It was the most detailed, reading, 3:10 a.m., February 19th, SS Naronic at sea. To who picks this up, report when you find this to our agents if not heard of before, that our ship is sinking fast beneath the waves. It's such a storm that we can never live in the small boats. One boat has already gone with her human cargo below. God let all of us live through this. We were struck by an iceberg in a blinding snowstorm and floated 2 hours. Now it's 3:20 a.m. by my watch, and the great ship is dead level with the sea. Report to the agents at Broadway, New York, M. Kersey and Company. Goodbye all. It was signed by John Olson Cattleman and also dated February 19th, 1893. Another message, this time found in the Irish Channel in June of that year. It read, Struck iceberg, sinking fast. Neuronic. The message was simply signed, Young. The final message was found on September 18th, floating in the Mersey River. It contained 2 strips of wool, and it read, "All hands lost, Neuronic. No time to say more." The message was signed with just a T. An official inquiry was held by the British Board of Trade at St. George Hall in Liverpool. The ship's design and cargo manifest were reviewed, and it was quickly determined that a sudden shift in cargo probably wasn't to blame. The harbor pilot was interviewed and reported nothing out of the ordinary while he was briefly on board the ship. Beyond that, the board had little to work with. There was speculation from the captain of another White Star ship, the Runic, that it was possible that the ship's engines could suffer a catastrophic malfunction that would result in one of her pistons shooting down through the hull, causing her to sink almost immediately. The Board of Trade was quick to dismiss the bottle messages and the iceberg theory. They claimed that there was no ice present, despite reports from other ships in the area that they had encountered ice near where the incident likely occurred. There is reason, however, to question the authenticity of the bottle messages. For one, none of the signed names, L. Wenzel, John Olson, or Young, appear on crew or passenger lists. And the final message was simply signed T, which could have been a number of people. Once the story appeared in papers, the missing ship was big news. So it's suspicious that the first message was found in New York only one day after the story first broke in the New York Times. The White Star Line also dismissed the second bottle as a hoax because they felt the bottle couldn't reach the spot where it was found. But debris from ships in the area has been found all along the eastern seaboard of the United States. Even if it's unlikely, it's not entirely impossible. While there's reason to doubt the messages, there's also reason to believe that they could be authentic. The names don't match the manifest, but it was very common at the time for passenger lists to be incomplete or inaccurate, especially on cargo ships. Even the Titanic, 20 years later, had 33 mistakes on her passenger lists. So it's not inconceivable that someone gave a different name, joined the crew at the last minute, or simply signed a nickname like Young. The first 2 bottles also list the same date, February 19th. Based on the Neuronic's speed and date of departure, she would have been in the area where her lifeboats were found at around the same time. The second bottle also listed several specific details and even correctly named the White Star agent in New York. These pranksters really did their homework. But if the bottles are hoaxes and the ship didn't strike an iceberg in a snowstorm, what could have happened to her? And if they're real, why were there no bodies or debris found? After survivors from the Titanic disaster were rescued from Collapsible A, the lifeboat was set adrift with 3 bodies. After drifting for a month, the boat was recovered by the RMS Oceanic. The 3 bodies were still in the small boat. In fact, the last bodies recovered from the Titanic were discovered a full 6 weeks after the tragedy. So why were there none found from the Neuronic? The last theory, and definitely the craziest one, came a decade later in 1903. A bomb was planted on the Cunard Line's RMS Umbria by a political terrorist who went by the name Gessler Rousseau. His real name was Gregory Russell. The bomb plot failed, and when he was arrested, newspapers claimed that a slip of paper was found in his room that read, "The destruction of the Neuronic was complete." Rousseau is completely forgotten now, but he was somewhat notorious at the time, and he was known to target British ships. But aside from being pretty bad at making bombs that actually worked, Rousseau was in America at the time of the Neuronic disaster, which would have made it pretty hard for him to board the ship in Liverpool. The story is likely a case of media sensationalism that does little to explain what actually happened to the Neuronic. thing that sticks with me most about the Neuronic mystery is not so much trying to figure out how it happened. We can gather that something went terribly wrong that caused the ship to sink with all on board. That's not really all that mysterious. The thing I get caught up on is the lonely terror of the situation. Knowing that your ship is sinking in the middle of the night, miles from anyone who can help. How it must have felt for the relatives of the 74 people on board. It's one thing to lose a loved one. It's another to always wonder what actually happened to them. No one even sent a proper search party after the ship went missing. The White Star Line altered the Titanic's route slightly after the incident to sail through the area where the Neuronic was thought to have been lost. That was it. Other passing ships were asked to keep an eye out, but once she was determined lost, that was pretty much all that happened. It's hard to imagine such indifference today. But after all, those 74 men weren't paying passengers. They were all replaceable employees. The Neuronic disaster happened 5 years before the Marconi Company began producing systems like the one installed in the Titanic. In that time, if you ran into trouble, your only hope was signaling a nearby ship. Or maybe survive long enough in a tiny lifeboat, which in heavy seas would be almost impossible. One of my favorite stories from the Titanic disaster is what happened on Saturday, April 13, 1912, the day before she struck the iceberg. That evening, while Chief Telegraph Operator John Phillips was at work sending messages, the Marconi machine suddenly stopped working. It was standard procedure at the time that if something went wrong with the equipment, the operators were not supposed to try and fix it. They were to wait until the ship reached shore, where a company technician could properly service the machine. Phillips and his assistant Harold Bride ignored the rules and spent 5 hours working late into the night to fix the equipment on their own. It's terrifying to imagine what would have happened if they hadn't fixed the machine when they did. The Titanic sank in 2 hours and 40 minutes. What if when the massive liner went down, the Carpathia wasn't racing to the scene where she would pick up the freezing survivors? It's likely what happened to the crew of the Neuronic. When whatever went wrong with the ship, whether it was a sudden engine malfunction or a collision with an iceberg in a blinding snowstorm, all they could do was wait for their ship to sink beneath them, leaving them alone in the icy waters. No one would know what happened to them. No one would know their state of mind in those final moments. They were simply gone. Thomas Ismay's revitalized White Star Line began with the maiden voyage of the first Oceanic in 1871. The innovative liner would help modernize the North Atlantic passenger trade by placing emphasis on passenger comfort and safety. Over the next several decades, the White Star Line would continue to innovate, building ever larger and more technologically advanced ocean liners. But by the 1920s, an unsteady financial position and a fleet diminished by war, tragedy, and poor decisions left the once great company at a crossroads. It was decided that in order to regain the company's dominance, they would build a revolutionary new 1,000-foot superliner powered entirely by diesel-electric engines. The new liner's name would harken back to the ship that started it all. But the third Oceanic would never be finished. Instead, the last gasps of the White Star Line would be played out by a modest liner constructed one slip away, the MV Britannic, the last liner to sail under the White Star Line flag. First World War took a heavy toll on the White Star Line. At the outset of the conflict, the company controlled 35 vessels, all of which served the war effort in some capacity. By war's end, the company lost 10 ships, including HMHS Britannic, the largest British passenger liner at the time. That left her sister, the RMS Olympic, the line's only surviving modern express liner available to service the critical Southampton to New York route. But the genesis of the company's decline began nearly 2 decades before. In 1902, the White Star Line was purchased by the International Mercantile Marine Company, or IMM for short. The company was owned by American banker J.P. Morgan, who you may know from your debit card. The company was formed with the intention of monopolizing the North Atlantic shipping trade by consolidating as many lines as possible. The White Star Line, which was under control of J. Bruce Ismay, was initially reluctant to agree to the deal. Ismay knew that his father, Thomas Ismay, who died in 1899, would have vehemently opposed such an arrangement. But Morgan was determined and offered extremely lucrative incentives to White Star Line's shareholders, convincing them to accept the offer. The company was by far the most successful subsidiary of the IMM and rapidly expanded their fleet in the pre-war years, culminating in the Olympic-class trio. But the trust was heavily criticized in both the United States and Britain after the Titanic disaster. J. Bruce Ismay never fully recovered after the tragedy, and he stepped away from the White Star Line on June 30, 1913. He was heavily blamed for the disaster, though he was officially cleared of any wrongdoing, and was actually credited with encouraging many reluctant passengers into the lifeboats that night, saving several lives. By the end of the war, it was clear to the IMM that their ambition of monopolizing the North Atlantic was unlikely to succeed, and the American company began looking for ways to unload their British holdings. An early attempt by Lord Peary and Owen Phillips, later known as Lord Kilsant, to purchase the company's British properties was blocked at the last minute by President Woodrow Wilson, resulting in a complicated and tense situation that kept the company in limbo through most of the next decade. During this time, the company struggled to replace liners lost in the war and relied on the older Big Four to supplement their most important routes. The RMS Olympic was returned to passenger service in 1920, and other IMM liners were tapped to supplement other routes. In 1922, the company received 3 German liners that were ceded to the British government as war reparations. These included the SS Bismarck, the largest passenger ship in the world at the time, which was renamed the RMS Majestic, the SS Berlin, which became the Arabic, and the SS Columbus, which became the RMS Homeric. The Majestic and Homeric were placed on the lucrative Southampton to New York route alongside the Olympic. The 3 liners were popular with passengers as the transatlantic immigration trade picked up in the early 1920s. This was until the United States passed the Immigration Act of 1924, greatly limiting the number of Europeans allowed to migrate to the United States. This had a major effect on all shipping lines, which depended on immigration to fill their liners. The White Star Line quickly shifted their strategy to focus on tourism and began refitting their ships to reflect the change. In 1926, Lord Kilsant, the chairman of Harland & Wolff, made a new bid to purchase the White Star Line from the IMM. This time, he was successful, and his Royal Mail Steam Packet Company took possession of the line on January 1, 1927. The acquisition made the company the largest shipping group in the world, but the move would eventually doom the White Star Line. Lord Kilsant's empire was heavily indebted from the beginning. The White Star Line remained successful, but profits were siphoned away to support other parts of the sprawling shipping empire, creating an unstable web of debt and mismanagement. Through all these changes, it was clear that the White Star Line needed new liners if the company had any chance of staying competitive. A massive new liner was laid down on June 28, 1928. The ambitious project would be the first liner to exceed 1,000 feet, and she would be by far the largest motor vessel ever constructed. Sure to be powerful, luxurious, and attention-grabbing, she would easily beat out the liners planned by Cunard and European rivals. This new liner would be the line's 3rd Oceanic. At the same time, a moderately sized motor vessel was also planned to help fill out the White Star Line fleet. Her keel was laid down on April 14, 1927 at Harland & Wolff in Belfast. But despite lofty ambitions, only one of these 2 ships would ever make it to launch. While the new Oceanic was designed to make a statement, the motor vessel being constructed nearby on slip number 1 was designed to be economical. Along with her planned sister ship, this new liner would have 2 propellers, each driven by a 5-cylinder, 4-stroke, double-acting diesel engine, giving her a planned service speed of 17.5 knots. This speed was far from fast, but the slower crossings allowed for lower tariffs and significantly greater fuel efficiency. The MV Britannic was launched on August 6, 1929. Only a couple of months later, the Wall Street crash of 1929 ushered in the Great Depression. Despite the downturn, construction on the vessel continued. But the Oceanic project, already delayed by changes to her complex propulsion system, was doomed as the downturn brought the financial difficulties of Lord Kilson's shipping empire to the surface. An appeal was made to the British government for support, but the request was refused and the project was ended for good. Her keel, hull plates, and other parts were repurposed for the Britannic and her sister ship, the MV Georgic, which was laid down in July 1929. Britannic sea trials began in May 1930. She came in at 26,943 tons. She was 683.6 feet long with a beam of 82.4 feet. She was designed as a cabin-class liner, an informal term for liners that were designed to offer comfort and luxury at affordable rates. Her original configurations could accommodate 504 cabin-class passengers, 551 tourist-class passengers, and 498 third-class passengers. When completed, she was the largest British motor vessel in service, and the second largest in the world after Italy's MS Augustus. The Britannic was equipped with 2 short, wide funnels to complement her exterior design, which combined classic styling and modernity. Her forward funnel was false and, ironically enough, was used to house smoking rooms for deck and engineering officers. She had a classic knife's-edge bow and a modern cruiser stern. While the Britannic was designed to offer crossings at affordable rates, she was appointed with luxurious accommodations that could easily compete with express liners. Her cabin-class dining saloon was decorated with Louis XIV style, and her other spaces took on similar classic styling, reminiscent of those found on older liners, with only hints of Art Deco. The movement was rapidly growing in popularity at the time, and would heavily influence her sister ship, the Georgic. The MV Britannic sailed her maiden voyage on June 28, 1930. The year would go on to be an absolute disaster for the White Star Line, which recorded its first deficit in its history. In an attempt to remedy the dire situation, many older vessels were sold. Still, the Britannic proved a perfect fit for the difficult financial times she came into service. Passengers loved her. She was modern, attractive, and affordable. By reducing operating costs, the White Star Line was able to offer reduced rates for a crossing that didn't feel cheap. Along with the Georgic, the 2 liners generated significant profit for the struggling company. The MV Britannic generated considerable public attention during her maiden voyage, with an estimated 14,000 people gathering to see her off in Liverpool. She earned a warm welcome when she arrived in New York, and around 1,500 people paid $1 each to tour her interiors. Initially, she was operated at a 16-knot service speed, but after her first 3 voyages, her speed was increased to 17.5 knots on westbound crossings and just over 19 knots on eastbound. Early on, she shared her route with 3 of the older Big Four, the Adriatic, the Baltic, and the Cedric, but soon she was joined by her running mate, the MV Georgic. While the Britannic was popular, she averaged only 609 passengers per voyage in her first 15 months of service, amounting to about 40% of her capacity. Like most White Star liners, her schedule was supplemented with occasional cruises from New York to destinations like the Mediterranean and the West Indies. Despite issues filling her cabin class, tourist class bookings on her sailings frequently sold out, and on some crossings, cabin class staterooms were used for tourist class passengers to accommodate the high demand. Still, her low operating costs and relative popularity made her by far the most profitable ship in the White Star Line fleet in 1931, and in the years that followed, her popularity grew. By 1933, she was exceeding 1,000 passengers per voyage, amounting to 65% of her capacity. That might not sound impressive, but it was the highest rated capacity for any transatlantic liner at the time, meaning that the modest MV Britannic was proving one of the most popular ways to cross the Atlantic. She and the MV Georgic were a rare bright spot in an industry struggling to survive the Depression. But their success couldn't overcome the damage done by Lord Kilson. As economic conditions worsened, his debts mounted. The situation came to a head in 1931 when he was charged with fraud and imprisoned. His abrupt departure left the ailing company in complete disarray. By that point, the White Star Line's only hope for survival was a bailout from the British government, who reluctantly agreed on one condition. They would have to merge with their longtime rival, the Cunard Line, which was experiencing a dire financial situation of its own. On May 10, 1934, Thomas Ismay and Samuel Cunard's legacies would combine to create the Cunard White Star Line. The merger would prove the death of the once proud White Star Line, but through it all, the Britannic would carry the company's legacy through the post-war era. Control of the new Cunard White Star Line was determined by the tonnage the two companies brought to the merger, which was unfortunate for the White Star Line as they recently sold a number of their ships in an attempt to alleviate their debt. This meant that Cunard held 62% of the new company, effectively taking control. Most of the White Star Line's ships were scrapped, including the RMS Olympic, affectionately known as Old Reliable, and the RMS Majestic, the largest ship ever operated by the company. The only liners that would remain in service were the Laurentic, the Georgic, and of course the Britannic. The two motor vessels were transferred to the London to New York route in April 1935. As the new company took shape and the decade drew on, the Britannic continued to build in popularity, even with new competition from cabin-class liners from the United States and France. By 1938, the Britannic was reaching 75% of her capacity. But on August 27, 1939, with war only a few days away, everything changed for the MV Britannic when she was requisitioned by the British government and converted to a troop ship in Southampton. Her first mission took her to Bombay, where she was fitted with additional armaments. She then returned to England and actually resumed commercial service in 1940, carrying a large number of refugees from Central Europe and children from the United Kingdom to North America. These voyages also carried a number of British and Canadian officials. Considerable efforts were taken to keep her positions a secret, though the still neutral United States continued to publish her arrival and departure times. But by August 23, 1940, the Britannic was once again requisitioned as a troop ship. She sailed multiple voyages to South Africa and India, as well as a number of transatlantic crossings. Her capacity was initially 3,000 troops, but this was later increased to a cramped 5,000. During the war, the Georgic was bombed, burned, and sank during a German bombing raid in Egypt. Despite her extensive damage, the ship was salvaged and eventually returned to service. While her running mate barely survived the war, the Britannic managed to make it through the conflict unscathed. Over the course of the war, the Britannic sailed 324,792 nautical miles and carried 173,550 people. She also played a part in the invasion of Normandy by bringing 20,000 US troops to Europe. The Ministry of War Transport held her in reserve until releasing her back to the Cunard White Star Line in March 1947. She was sent to Harland & Wolff's yard in Liverpool, where she would undergo a significant refit to bring her back into passenger service. In 1949, the slow death of the White Star Line was completed when the Cunard Line bought out White Star's share of the business. Starting in 1950, the company would simply be known as the Cunard Line. Despite the change, both the Britannic and the Georgic continued to sail under both house flags and maintained the White Star livery. Britannic was extensively refitted after the war. These refits were a perfect opportunity to make major improvements and modernize the popular liner. The work was slowed by post-war material shortages and cost £1 million to complete. She was converted from a 3 to a 2 class configuration, and her passenger capacity was lowered from 1,553 to 1,049, with 551 in cabin class and 498 in tourist. Many of her cabins were enlarged and equipped with bathrooms, and her interiors were redecorated in an Art Deco style similar to the decor on the Georgic. She was also equipped with new safety features, including a modern fire detection system. These refits increased her tonnage to 27,666. She re-entered service on May 22, 1948, on the Liverpool to New York route, and was welcomed into New York Harbor with a traditional water salute. The Britannic's post-war career was just as successful as her pre-war sailings. She filled around 80% of her capacity on most voyages and even reached 92% on some crossings. The post-war years from the late 1940s through the early 1950s generated significant profits for the Cunard Line and represented the last golden age of ocean travel. But as you no doubt already know, as the 1950s wore on, signs of trouble began to emerge for the company as jet travel took hold at the end of the decade. Despite all this, the Britannic remained popular, and she operated extended cruises from New York to the Mediterranean during the winter months. Her crossings were mostly uneventful, but she did suffer a minor head-on collision with the American cargo ship, the Pioneer Land, in thick fog near the Ambrose Lightship in June 1950, but she avoided major damage in the incident and continued her eastbound crossing. In 1953 and 1955, she suffered minor fires, though neither incident resulted in any major damage or injury to her passengers or crew. The Georgic didn't enjoy the same kind of post-war career as her former running mate. The damage she suffered during the war meant that she was not fully restored to her pre-war luxury, and she was used as a utilitarian immigration ship operating between the UK and Australia. She was briefly used as a troop ship in the Korean War, and she was finally withdrawn from service in 1955. This left the MV Britannic the last liner to sail under the White Star Line flag. The once dominant shipping empire was now reduced to a single, moderately sized liner. In her later years, she operated both transatlantic voyages and extended cruises. In 1960, her 1961 schedule was published, but these crossings would never take place. On May 9, 1960, the crankshaft on one of her main engines cracked. She was forced to remain in New York until repairs could be made in July, costing the company $40,000 and causing her to miss 3 more voyages. While she was returned to service, it was soon announced that she would sail her final voyage with Cunard in December of 1960. Her routes would be taken over by the recently launched RMS Sylvania. Her final sailing left New York on November 25, 1960, and arrived in Liverpool on December 3rd. Only a few weeks later, the final White Star liner was sent for scrapping, which was completed at the end of 1961. The MV Britannic was the last breath of success for the White Star Line as the once great company receded into failure. She was perfectly suited for the time she was launched and proved that even in their final years, the White Star Line was still capable of innovating. Now, the company is mostly known for disaster, a cruel and largely inaccurate stand-in for recklessness and poorly managed ships. But this reputation is far from reality. The White Star Line built and operated some of the most innovative and influential ships to ever sail. More than anything, the company's biggest downfall was a lack of luck that was compounded by financial mismanagement in their final years. Still, if their merger happened only a few years earlier, the White Star Line would probably have emerged as the dominant company, and perhaps would still be sailing today instead of Cunard. But who knows? The MV Britannic proves what the company was capable of. A beautiful ship that offered passengers a safe, comfortable, and affordable way to cross the Atlantic. And they loved her for it.